Well, good morning, everybody. Glad to see all of you here with us this morning. It is so good to see some faces which we've not seen for a while. Family that's visiting in. It is, we're just as soon as we try to get back to normal, there's a spike. But that happens, and that's part of the process. And this will eventually work itself out. So again, I'm glad to see everybody here. I appreciate folks checking on Amanda and Lakeland. They're both doing well. And they will hopefully be back with us soon. This morning, we are in the book of Hebrews. I love the book of Hebrews. It is such a powerful and action-packed book. It does not go the route of a typical letter. This is a sermon. And if you're with us for our in-depth study of Hebrews a few weeks back, then you would know that. But this is ultimately a sermon written to I'd say anonymous. There was intentionality with its audience, but we don't know who the audience was. But we know it was a group of New Testament Jewish Christians that were under persecution, that were walking away from Jesus Christ. And the author is anonymous. It's not signed. There's theories and thoughts as to who the author is, but ultimately we don't know. But what we do know is that the emphasis and the point of this book is evident. It is all about Jesus Christ and his superiority to everything else. We know this because the author makes several Jewish references to things which the Jews held in high esteem. There's mention of the angels, there's mentions of Moses, there's mentions of the altar, of the tabernacle, of the sacrifice, of the priest, of different aspects of Jewish worship and religion, which they held to be in such high esteem. And the author makes this comparison and contrast to Christ and these things, saying Jesus is above all of these things. So we know ultimately that the emphasis is on Jesus and his superiority. Now, before we get too deep into this letter, because we'll actually be here for 2 weeks, before we get too deep into this letter, I want us to start back in Luke chapter 9. And this will make sense as we go through. What's happening here in Luke chapter 9 is we're about to read of the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, to where he goes on the mountaintop or mountainside with with some of his disciples. And well, let's just read here, Luke 9, starting in verse 28. And we will read and discuss. It says, about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up on the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. How did they know it was Moses and Elijah? That's always a question that pops up. Well, how'd they know? Because they'd never seen them. And it was against Jewish law for them to draw pictures because that would be considered a type of idolatry. There's a lot of indication that once we're in heaven, we are going to know others, or we're going to know as others have been known, so that's how we believe that they knew who they were there. Verse 31 says this: it says, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. All right, so don't feel bad if you ever get sleepy in prayer or get sleepy during church, because that happens even here to Peter and John. Imagine this scene. They're up there on the mountain. Christ is praying. They tend to drift off, and when they come to, it's like they have this in-between moment where you dream something and you're not sure if it's real or not. So they're sort of halfway dreaming here. Well, that looks like Moses and Elijah, and then they wake up and there they are. They cannot believe it. And here's what we read. It says, as the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it is good for us to be here. That's his way of saying, would you look what we got going on? He said, let's put up 3 shelters, or your translation may say tents. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. It says he did not know what he was saying. Of course, he just woke up from they just woke up from the best dream and then saw it was real. So there's a lot of excitement that's going on here. And sometimes when you're coming out of sleep, you sometimes say things you might not mean to say or need to say. We can go into those stories later on. With him wanting to put up these shelters or these tents, there's a lot of discussion as to exactly what that means. What's happening here is they are equating or elevating Moses and Elijah to such a status to where it lowers or diminishes Jesus Christ. And actually what it is they kind of believe they're being complimentary to Christ by elevating him to the status of these heroes of theirs, Moses and Elijah, because these two men held great esteem and great clout within the Jewish people. He had kind of missed the whole point of the last 3 years with Jesus. And here's what happens in verse 34. It says, while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid and entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, this is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone, and the disciples kept this to themselves. I'm sure they did. And did not tell anyone at the time what they had seen. All right, so there's a lot of different ideas as to what that cloud meant. I encourage you on your own time, go back to the book of Ezekiel. Read the first 20 to 30 verses. You see Ezekiel there is a man who was kind of robbed of the opportunity to be a priest due to the exile. And he's in a refugee camp by the river Chebar, which is actually more like a drainage ditch, and he sees this cloud coming towards him. And the language he uses to describe the cloud is nothing short of awe-inspiring and terrifying. Because what's happening is the forward guard of God is coming towards him. Not that God needs a guard, but his entourage, if you will. And I don't even know if that language is appropriate still, but nonetheless, God is showing up to talk to Ezekiel, and I believe that's what's happening here in Luke chapter 9, is Peter and John give too much attention that they elevate Moses and Elijah, lowering Jesus, not intentionally, but that's what they were doing, and then all of a sudden the cloud of God descends upon them, and it got their attention. And this voice of God says, this is my son, listen to him. See, we see even in those times, those that were directly with Christ had to be reminded of his preeminence and of his superiority. The entirety of the Old Testament points towards Jesus Christ. And every moment after the ascension of Christ points backwards towards Jesus Christ. All of Paul's writings, James, Peter, the Revelation, everything points back towards Jesus. It's like you have these two arrows pointing towards something, and in the center is Christ Jesus. And in case we didn't know, and I'm not being sarcastic here, the whole purpose and point of the Bible is Jesus Christ and his redemptive story. It amazes me how many people don't know that. I gave a similar lesson at another church, and a woman that had been in the church for upwards of 70 years said, I never knew that. And then we had a chance to discuss this. And she had been kind of taught and understood that the Old Testament were stories of wisdom that we kind of learned from. The New Testament tells us that Jesus saves us, but then we listen and follow what Paul said because that's practical, daily living stuff. Now, Paul, we listen to Paul, we read Paul, we study Paul. You cannot read Paul accurately unless you first or filter him through Jesus Christ. Everything Paul says has to be understood under the umbrella of Christ. When God speaks, we listen. And that's what we see in the book of Hebrews, is the writers telling this group of New Testament Jewish Christians that you have to focus and you have to keep your eyes on Jesus Christ. As a parent, I tell my children all the time, focus, focus, focus. My wife tells me all the time because I'm so ADHD, Matt, you have to focus, because I'll do 1,000 different things and do them fairly well, but not the best. And so we always have to focus on what is the most important thing in our life, and that is Jesus Christ. It is so easy for us to get distracted. God has one message for those on the mountain, and that is listen to Jesus. Focus on Him. Hebrews tells us that Jesus is all about our focus. It's the reminder for us to stay on task and not forget why we do what we do. And everything we do has to come from the standpoint of, does this glorify Jesus Christ? It's so much greater than, does this make the church look good? Does this make me look like a good Christian? Does this make me look like a good, moral, kind person? It's, does this glorify Christ? Because when you start to go to subjective standards such as, well, how does this make me look? And again, we can still go to biblical passages saying you have to represent the church right, but your perspective, it's not doesn't make Matt look good. It does this glorify and make Jesus look like He wants to be looked like. We see in Romans chapter 1, as Lonnie read for us this morning, didn't get to the section of the chapter that I'm referencing here, but still, it ties in. Romans chapter 1, Paul says that God's invisible qualities are made known if you focus and if you look and you see Him there in front of you. We know the prophets spoke about the Christ who was to come and His redemptive story. And now we see Jesus Christ has now spoken to His people. Let's go to the book of Hebrews, start in chapter 1. And again, we're not going to move through the entire book at this pace. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets and at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and through whom also He made the universe. Make a note here that the author is starting this letter with this sermon off saying, hey, in case you forgot, Jesus is supreme. He says He trumps everybody and everything else. And all the writers that talk about Him come in His wake, speaking His message, and you have to keep that in mind. Here's what He says in verse 3. He says, the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of His being, sustaining all things by His powerful word. After He had provided purifications for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So He became as much superior to the angels as the name He has inherited is superior to theirs. To sum that up, it's saying Jesus is supreme. Focus on Him. Ask yourself a question. Why do you do the Christian things you do? Again, many of us jump to Paul to find a legal checklist of things for us to follow. But if we start going to the why do I do this and why do I not do that sort of list, we might find ourselves not really being able to adequately answer why my theology is the way it is. Because a lot of it points back to our legalistic traditions that we've always done, and we don't really understand the reason why. Just a moment ago, hope you don't mind, Dustin made a joke. He said to me, said we didn't bless the trash can, which is true. I didn't bless the trash. But if we do this enough, generations from now, they might be passing a trash can and have no idea why. You kind of get my point there. It's sometimes we fall into such a routine, we forget the reason and the purpose for why we do what it is we're doing. The Hebrew writer here says, don't forget, this is about Jesus Christ. Don't forget that we do everything in His name for His name's sake. Don't fall into this rut of just doing what we do because that's how we've done it and we're pretty sure we're right, but we don't know. Focus on Jesus. Keep your eyes on Him. Here's what Paul says in Colossians 1, starting in verse 15. He says, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through Him and for Him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him we have all the fullness of God. All the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were once alienated from the hostile mind, and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Indeed, you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. Sometimes we don't focus on Jesus. And Paul has to remind the church there at Colossae, don't forget why you're doing this. Don't forget who saved you. Don't forget who you once were. It wasn't a set of rules and checklist of spiritual things that saved you. He said the blood that was shed on the cross, that's what saved you. It was all about Jesus Christ and pointing back towards him. We bear the name Christ on the sign there in the parking lot. But do we truly understand that this is all about the Creator? The one who Paul said was the firstborn from the dead. We look at things surrounding him and different practical aspects of Christian living. Sometimes we take parts of the New Testament out of context to fit our favorite aspects of Christianity. Again, go back. Does it look like Jesus and sound like him? He is the lens that we look through for everything. He is that filter which we use to see the world. Because I now try to look at others the way Christ did, I don't see an enemy. I don't see someone that stands on the other side against me who I have to get back. I see a child of God that has lost their way, that needs to see Jesus Christ in me. Because Jesus is preeminent and because he is our everything, we look at others and we look at the situations in the world through those eyes of Christ. And that's hard because my sinful, fleshful self gets in the way. I get frustrated with what's happening. I used to follow political news very thoroughly. The last couple weeks, I get a 5-minute blip, turn it off. I find myself getting so worked up and so angry over things. And that's kind of what they want. And I don't care what side you watch. That's what they want, is to stir us up, to follow them, to push their agenda, whatever it's going to be. It has to be through Jesus that we approach everything. When you go through the book of Matthew, start there in chapter 5 and walk through the Sermon on the Mount. Christ addresses different aspects of daily living. He addresses anger. He addresses adultery. He addresses multiple times through Scripture the way we use and spend our money, the way we look for and care after others. Every aspect of daily living is within the New Testament under the teachings of Christ. So I got to ask myself, do I address things the way Christ does? Not the way a Christian does, because sometimes that might be different. Or the way this group of Christians do. It all has to come through Jesus Christ. The world can make us dizzy. It's always a fun thing to watch adults try to play that game where they'll spin around a bat and then try to race to a place. Kids can do it. Because their equilibrium system is not as solidified as ours, so they don't get dizzy as easily as we do. And so you watch us as adults spin a couple times, and then we're tumbling over. And then you watch on the Winter Olympics those skaters that can spin however many times, and then they just keep on going. The way they can pull that off is they find a focal point and they keep their eyes on it. So when their world is literally spinning around them, they don't get lost in it. For us, as believers in Jesus Christ, who earnestly and sincerely and honestly try to follow Him as best we can, the world is spinning around us, and it's easy to get caught up in this mess, and we have to find our focal point, and that is Jesus Christ. Just as God said in Luke chapter 9 to the disciples on the mountain, "This is my son, I chose him, listen to him." It's easy for us to follow our favorite teacher or preacher or person of influence, whoever that may be. That's what was happening at Corinth. But Paul had to say, he said, no, not even me. It's about Jesus. You follow him, you focus on him. He is our focal point. He is the place to which we are tethered, and he ties us and holds us down and keeps us safe. And if we're able to keep our focus on Jesus, then we should be able to make it through anything and everything. We may not come out unscathed, but we'll make it through. When Christ's disciples were crossing the water in a boat, a storm rose up around them. And you know the story. Christ starts to walk out there to them. The storm is raging, and they see what they think is a ghost, and they become afraid. And then Christ says what? It says, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And then what does Peter say? "Lord, if it is you, call me out there to you." And he says, "Come on." So Peter gets out of the boat and begins to walk on the water towards Jesus Christ. But the minute he takes his focus off of him, what does he do? He begins to sink. Too many of us right now have our eyes somewhere else other than Jesus, and we don't even realize that we're drowning. Jesus is calling out to us, reaching out towards us just as he reached out and caught and saved Peter. So, you of little faith, why did you doubt? The book of Hebrews, which we will spend a lot more time in next week. The book of Hebrews was written to a group of people whose focus was elsewhere, and they were drowning and didn't even realize it. They were leaning back on their old style of Judaism and thought that was enough. They thought their rituals were going to save them, and the Hebrew writer says, no, don't forget Jesus. Don't forget to keep your eyes on him. The message for us this morning that we will take with us for the rest of this week, hopefully, is that we need to realign our focus on Jesus Christ. We need to look at him. Everything we read through the Old New Testament is filtered through Jesus Christ. And if we do it any other way, we're probably going to be reading it incorrectly. Life can get crazy, life can get hard, life can get very distracting, as we know very well right now. Don't forget to focus on Jesus. However the gospel applies to you this morning, maybe you've not put on Christ on baptism and you want to learn more about that, or you want to be baptized in Jesus Christ. Or maybe you're wondering, well, why be baptized at all? We can study about that. Or maybe life has got you a little dizzy and your focus is a little askew, and you need to be reminded and you need to come back to Jesus Christ and him alone. That's available too. Or maybe you just need to respond right where you are. That's also appropriate. However the gospel call applies to you this morning, let's stand and let's sing for your encouragement.